The walk from the creek to the cabin had become so familiar by now that your feet found the path without any need for light. The snow had packed down into a shallow trench that wound between the black spruce, their branches heavy and still, and the only sound was the faint squeak of your mooklooks pressing into the cold crystals with each step. Overhead the sky had deepened from a pale grey into a blue so dark it was almost black, and a few faint stars were already pricking through where the clouds had thinned, though you did not look up for long because the cold air stung your cheeks and made your eyelashes feel stiff. The last true light of the day was slipping away behind the ridges to the west, leaving the world in a kind of twilight that turned every tree into a silhouette, every shadow into a pool of deeper darkness. Your body moved through this fading landscape with the slow automatic rhythm of a man who has spent the entire day bent over a gravel bar, your shoulders aching in a dull, even way that you no longer really noticed, your legs heavy but still steady. In your right hand you carried the gold pan, its rim pressed against your thigh, and the metal had grown so cold that it seemed to pull the warmth right out of your mitten. So you switched hands once and then again, trading the discomfort from one palm to the other as you walked. Ahead, the cabin revealed itself not as a shape so much as a darker rectangle against the trees, a low silhouette with a single thin line of smoke rising from the stovepipe, barely visible against the sky, twisting once before the wind caught it and pulled it away into nothing. That thin thread of smoke was the only sign that the cabin was more than a heap of logs, the only promise of warmth and shelter in a valley that otherwise belonged to the ice and the silence. When you reached the door, you stopped for a moment, not from any hesitation but simply because the stillness of the evening invited you to pause, to listen to the immense quiet that filled the spaces between the trees. No wind stirred, no animal called, no water ran. The creek itself was sealed under 2 feet of ice and a blanket of snow, and the only sound was the faint tick of the cold settling deeper into the ground, a sound that was more felt than heard, a low, distant compression of the earth that came up through the soles of your mocklooks and into your bones. You lifted your free hand and placed it on the door, feeling the rough grain of the planks under the wool of your mitten, the texture of the wood familiar in a way that words could not capture, because it was a knowledge stored in your fingers from countless returns, just like this one. The door was built from 3 wide planks of spruce, pegged together with wooden dowels and hung on leather hinges that had grown stiff with the cold, and the latch was a simple length of iron, shaped by a blacksmith in Dawson, its surface darkened by the oil from many hands. You grasped the latch, lifted it, and felt the slight resistance as the catch released. Then you leaned your shoulder against the door and pushed, and the door swung inward with a low creak that was more a vibration than a sound, the leather hinges groaning in the cold, the bottom edge scraping against the packed snow that had drifted against the threshold. A puff of warmer air, barely warmer but noticeably different from the biting cold outside, brushed past your face, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke, old coffee, and the faint clean scent of spruce boughs that you had laid on your bunk weeks ago, now dried and aromatic. You stepped inside and turned to close the door behind you, and for a few seconds you stood in a darkness so complete that you could see nothing at all, not even your own hand, when you lifted it in front of your face. The darkness was thick, heavy, like a substance that filled the room from floor to ceiling, pressing against your eyes with a gentle weight that was not unpleasant, only absolute. You reached back and found the door by touch, your fingers closing around the edge of the planks, and you pulled it shut with a slow, steady motion, feeling the seal of cold air that had formed around the frame break, and then close again as the door settled into place. The latch dropped with a soft thunk that resonated through the wood and into the stillness of the cabin, a sound that seemed to mark the boundary between the outside world and this small enclosed space, a sound that seemed to mark the boundary between the outside world and this smalakandip. After the door closed, you leaned your back against it for a moment, feeling the cold that still radiated from the wood seep through your coat, and you let out a breath that you had not realized you were holding, watching it bloom in front of you as a faint cloud of vapor that the darkness swallowed almost instantly. The air inside the cabin was still, so still that you could hear the tiny tick of the stove expanding with the heat of the coals, a sound so faint that it was more like a thought than a noise, a rhythmic click that came every few seconds, regular as a pulse. You stood there with your back against the door, your gold pan now resting on the floor beside your foot, and you let the deep silence of the cavern wash over you, layer by layer, until you felt the tension in your shoulders begin to loosen, a slow, gradual release that spread down your spine and into your hips and legs. The darkness was not uniform. As you stood there, letting your eyes adjust, you began to perceive the faintest trace of light coming from the far side of the room, a low orange glow that seemed to emanate from a single point near the floor, pulsing softly with the rhythm of the stove's breathing. It was the mica window in the front of the little cast-iron stove, a small square of translucent mineral that glowed like a dying ember, casting just enough light to outline the shape of the stove itself, its squat, rounded body, the curve of the door, the short length of pipe that rose up and disappeared into the blackness near the ceiling. The glow was so weak that it illuminated only a small circle of the floor, directly in front of the stove, a patch of rough plank flooring where the light caught the edge of a braided rag rug, its faded colors reduced to shades of gray and amber. Beyond that small island of light, the rest of the cabin remained hidden in shadow, the walls and the ceiling lost in the dark, the corners of the room retreating into a soft, impenetrable black. But you knew that the darkness was not empty. You knew that the shapes of your everyday life were there, waiting for your eyes to find them, waiting for the slow process of adjustment that would, in time, peel back the layers of shadow and reveal the familiar contours of the bunk, the shelf, the table, the bucket, the axe, the small collection of things that made up your existence in this remote place. You stayed where you were for another long moment, letting the warmth of the stove reach you across the room in slow, gentle waves that you could feel on your cheeks and on the backs of your hands. A warmth that was so subtle it was more like the memory of heat than heat itself. A promise that the stove was still alive, that the fire had not gone out during the long hours you had spent at the creek. The temperature inside the cabin was not warm by any ordinary measure. It was perhaps just above freezing, cold enough that your breath still misted faintly in the air, cold enough that the water in the bucket by the door carried a thin skin of ice that crackled softly when the bucket was disturbed. But compared to the biting 30 below air outside, this air felt almost comfortable, an enveloping coolness that did not attack the skin but simply surrounded it, a still, motionless cold that asked nothing of you except that you stand quietly and let your body adjust to being indoors. After a while you pushed yourself away from the door and began to move across the floor, your steps slow and deliberate, your feet finding their way by memory more than by sight. The floorboards were uneven, some of them warped by the cycles of freezing and thawing that came with the changing seasons, and you knew exactly where the loose plank was, the one that tilted slightly under your weight and produced a soft creak, a sound that had become so familiar that you no longer heard it as a noise, but simply as a confirmation of where you were. You stepped around that plank without thinking, your body remembering what your eyes could not yet see, and you moved toward the center of the room where the table stood, a solid, heavy presence that you could sense, even in the dark, a block of denser shadow among shadows. Your outstretched hand found the edge of the table, your fingers brushing against the rough, splintery surface that you had planed yourself months ago with a draw knife, and you traced the grain of the wood, feeling the small ridges and valleys that your touch knew intimately. The table was cold to the touch but not freezing, and you let your hand rest there for a moment, grounding yourself in the tangible reality of the room, anchoring your senses to something solid and real. As your eyes continued their slow work of adjusting to the dim light, the shapes around you began to emerge from the darkness like islands rising from a receding tide, first as vague suggestions of form, then as more distinct outlines, and finally as recognizable objects that carried the weight of daily use and familiarity. To your left, against the wall, the bunk took shape, a low platform of poles lashed together with rawhide, raised about 2 feet off the floor, and on it the thick mattress of spruce boughs that you had cut and laid fresh just a few weeks ago, their needles now dried and fragrant, releasing a clean, sharp scent that mingled with the wood smoke. On top of the boughs was a wool blanket, its grey surface rumpled and folded back where you had left it this morning, and beside it a pillow made from a flour sack stuffed with more spruce tips and a few scraps of cloth, its shape lumpy and familiar. Above the bunk, a small shelf had been nailed to the logs, and on it you could just make out the silhouette of a candle stub, a tin of matches, and a small, worn book whose pages had swollen with moisture and then dried again, the cover now warped and curled. The sight of these things, so ordinary and so constant, settled something inside you, a quiet recognition that this was your place, your small corner of shelter in a vast and indifferent wilderness. To your right, the shelf that held your provisions came into view, a single white plank resting on wooden pegs driven into the gaps between the logs. Even in the dim orange glow you could see the neat row of supplies arranged there, the blue enameled tin of beans, the cotton sack of flour with its neck twisted shut and tied with a piece of string, the slab of salt pork wrapped in cheesecloth and resting on a tin plate, the small paper packet of baking powder, the dented can of ground coffee that you had traded for in Dawson, and that still held the rich dark smell that reminding you of mornings. Each item had its place. Each had been set there with the careful economy of a man who had learned to treat every object with respect, because replacing it meant a long journey and a great deal of effort, and the sight of the shelf with its orderly arrangement was a small comfort that you allowed yourself to absorb without hurry. You did not need to count the cans or measure the flour tonight. That task could wait for later, when the lamp was lit and the world had shrunk to the small circle of light around the table. For now it was enough to know that everything was where it should be, that nothing had been disturbed, that the cabin had waited for you in perfect stillness while you worked. Beyond the shelf, barely visible in the far corner, the water bucket stood on the floor, a wooden pail with a rope handle, its sides dark with moisture and the thin layer of ice that formed on the surface of the water each night, a crust so thin that it would break at the slightest touch and melt on your tongue with the taste of snowmelt and spruce. Next to the bucket, leaning against the wall, was the axe, its handle worn smooth by your grip, its blade covered with a leather sheath that you had stitched yourself from a scrap of moose hide, the stitches uneven but strong. And above the axe, on a peg driven into one of the logs, hung your heavy coat, the one you wore on the very coldest days, a shapeless garment of wool and canvas that seemed to hold the cold even when it was empty, as if the fabric itself remembered the long hours it had spent in the wind and the snow. You looked at these things, each in turn, and you felt a quiet sense of completeness, a feeling that everything in this room had a purpose and a history, that nothing was wasted, that every nail and peg and scrap of cloth had been placed here by your own hands in the slow, patient accumulation of a life lived alone in the northern wilderness. The table itself occupied the center of the room, and as your eyes grew more accustomed to the low light, you could see the objects that rested on its surface, the kerosene lamp, its brass base tarnished to a dull brown, its glass chimney clear and waiting, a tin plate with a fork and spoon laid beside it, a small knife with a bone handle, a folded square of cloth that served as a napkin, and a clay mug, its rim chipped, still holding the dregs of this morning's coffee, now frozen into a thin brown ice that gleamed in the faint crunch. You reached out and touched the lamp, your fingers tracing the curve of the glass, and you considered lighting it. But the thought passed without urgency, because the darkness was not uncomfortable, not yet, and the faint light from the stove was enough to move by, enough to see the outlines of the things you needed. There was a certain peace in the darkness, a softness that the sharp light of the lamp would chase away, and you wanted to linger in that peace for just a little longer, to let the day's work settle into the past, to let the cold night outside become something distant and unreal. You moved around the table and crossed the remaining space to the stove, your footsteps quiet on the floorboards, the rug muffling the sound as you stepped onto its woven surface. The stove stood on 4 short iron legs, its body a compact cylinder of cast iron, its surface darkened by layers of soot and oil and the fine grey ash that had settled there over many fires. The mica window glowed with a deep, pulsing orange light that seemed to breathe, brightening and dimming in a slow, irregular rhythm as the coals inside shifted and settled. You crouched down in front of the stove, feeling the warmth radiate against your face and chest, a warmth that seeped through your coat and your shirt and finally reached your skin, loosening the tightness that the cold had drawn across your cheeks and around your eyes. You held your hands out toward the window, not touching the iron, just letting the radiant heat wash over them, and you watched the coals through the mica, a bed of embers that glowed like a tiny, contained sunset, with fissures of brighter orange that ran through the darker reds like rivers of light. The coals shifted with a soft, whispering sound, a rustle of ash and collapsing carbon, and a small flame flickered up for a moment, blue at its base and yellow at its tip, before subsiding back into the embers. The sight was hypnotic, a slow, repeating pattern of light and shadow that held your attention without demanding anything in return. A quiet display of energy that was slowly, patiently releasing the stored warmth of the wood into the room. The floor near the stove was warm enough that you could feel it through your mukluks, a gentle heat that rose up through the soles of your feet and spread into your ankles and calves, and you remained crouched there for a long time, letting the warmth work its way into the deeper layers of your body, into the muscles that had been tense against the cold all day, into the joints that ached from the repetitive motion of the pan, into the very center of your chest where the cold seemed to have settled like a stone. The day's fatigue began to surface, not as an unpleasant weight, but as a gentle heaviness that pulled at your eyelids and softened your breathing, and you realized that you were tired in a way that was complete, a tiredness that extended through every part of you, from the soles of your feet to the crown of your head, a tiredness that was earned and honest and in its own way, deeply satisfying. You straightened up slowly, your knees popping softly in the quiet room, and you stood for a moment looking down at the stove, watching the glow pulse and fade, pulse and fade. The fire would need another log soon, but there was no hurry. The coals were still strong, still radiating a steady warmth that would last for another hour or more before they began to cool. You would tend the fire later, after you had taken off your outer layers, after you had lit the lamp and set the coffee to boil, after you had settled into the long, slow rhythm of the evening. For now, it was enough to stand in the quiet darkness, to feel the cabin around you like a shell that held the cold at bay, to listen to the silence that was not really silent, because it was filled with small, soft sounds, the tick of the stove, the creak of the logs as they adjusted to the changing temperature, the faint, distant whisper of the wind as it moved through the spruce outside, the sound of your own breath, slow and rising and falling in the dark. You had come in from the frozen night, and the night was still out there, immense and patient, but in here, in this small room of logs and chinking and the lingering scent of spruce, there was only stillness, only the slow, quiet work of waiting for sleep, which would come in its own time, as it always did, when the cabin had grown warm and the darkness had become complete. The decision to feed the fire did not arrive as a conscious thought, so much as a slow recognition that settled into your limbs, a quiet understanding that the coals, though still glowing, would not last through the longest hours of the night without something more to consume. You had been standing motionless before the stove for a span of time that felt both brief and endless, your body still wrapped in its many layers of wool and canvas, your cheeks still holding the memory of the frozen air outside, and the warmth that radiated from the mica window had softened the edges of your fatigue until you felt almost weightless, suspended between the labor of the day and the deep rest that lay ahead. Now, without hurry, you turned away from the orange glow and faced the dark corner near the stovepipe where the woodpile waited, a neat stack of split spruce that rose from the floor to the height of your hip, its outline barely visible against the log wall, the ends of the logs catching just enough light to glimmer as pale, dry circles in the shadows. The sight of that stack was a comfort of its own, a promise of continued warmth stored in the dense fibers of the wood, each piece a compact bundle of summer sunlight that had been absorbed by the tree long before you ever set foot in this valley, now patiently waiting to be released back into the cold air of the cabin. You crossed the short distance in 2 steps, your mukluks brushing against the braided rug, and you crouched down beside the woodpile, feeling the cooler air near the floor wrap around your ankles while the heat from the stove continued to bathe your upper body in a gentle, uneven warmth that seemed to hold you from 2 sides at once. The stack had been built with the same careful attention you gave to everything in the cabin, the logs arranged in alternating directions so that the pile remained stable, the largest pieces at the bottom and the smaller splits on top, a system that required no thought to maintain because it had become as natural as stacking stones. You reached out and let your mitten rest on the topmost piece, not yet lifting it, simply feeling the rough, fibrous texture of the split surface through the wall, the grain of the wood running in straight, parallel lines that your fingertip traced without conscious intent. The spruce was dry. It had been cut the previous autumn from a stand of trees up the slope, hauled back to the cabin on a makeshift sled, and split with the axe that now leaned against the wall, its blade still sheathed in moose hide. Months of sitting beside the stove had drawn every trace of moisture from the fibers, leaving the wood light and porous. Its color faded from the creamy white of fresh-cut timber to a dull, silvery tan that seemed to hold a kind of quiet patience, as if the log itself understood its purpose and waited without complaint for its turn to burn. You lifted the piece from the stack, feeling its weight settle into your palm, a solid heft that was neither too heavy nor too light, just substantial enough to remind you that this was a thing of substance, a fragment of a living tree that had stood for decades on the hillside, drinking from the thin soil and reaching for the brief, intense sun of the northern summers. You turned it over in your hands, your mittens muffling the sensation but not entirely obscuring the small details, the pattern of the saw cut at one end, the slightly rougher surface where the axe blade had separated the wood along its natural grain, the tiny resin pockets that had crystallized into amber beads, hard and glossy, catching the faint light from the stove like specks of trapped honey. You raised the log to your face and inhaled, and the scent that rose from the dry fibers was sharp and clean, a distillation of the forest itself, carrying notes of pine and earth and the faint sweetness of sap that had long since hardened but still released its perfume when the wood was warmed by your breath. The smell was so familiar now that it had become the background of your existence, woven into every meal and every dream. But in this quiet moment, with nothing else to distract you, you noticed it freshly, a small pleasure that asked nothing in return. You set the log down on the floor beside you, its end tapping softly against the planks, and you reached for the stove door, your fingers finding the small iron handle that projected from the front of the cast iron body, a handle shaped like a coiled serpent, or perhaps just a lump of crude metal, worn smooth by the grip of many hands over years before the stove ever reached your cabin. The handle was warm but not hot, warm enough that you could feel the heat through your mitten, a gentle, insistent pressure that reminded you of the fire waiting inside. You lifted the handle and pulled, and the door swung open on its hinges with a low, resonant creak that seemed to fill the entire room, a sound made of metal rubbing against metal, a sound that spoke of expansion and contraction, of the slow dance between heat and cold that the stove performed every day and every night. The creak faded into the silence, and the firebox was revealed, a square, dark cavern lined with ash and glowing embers, the sudden brightness of it stinging your eyes for just a moment before they adjusted. Inside the stove, the bed of coals lay like a miniature landscape, a terrain of red and orange and deepest black, with hills of ash that had built up around the edges and valleys where the glow was brightest, pulsing with a slow, regular rhythm that matched the sound of the stove's breathing. The coals nearest the center still held their shape. The ghostly outlines of the logs, they had once been still visible in the lattice of carbon that glowed with an intense, concentrated heat, while along the edges the embers had crumbled into a fine, soft powder of white and grey, feather-light and ready to drift away at the slightest disturbance. A few small flames licked up from the crevices between the coals, blue at their roots and yellow at their tips, dancing with a gentle, almost lazy motion that seemed disconnected from any purpose, merely a byproduct of the heat, a decoration rather than a necessity. The air inside the firebox shimmered with the rising current of heat, a transparent ripple that distorted the back wall of the stove into wavering, liquid shapes, and you could feel that heat wash over your face in a wave as you leaned closer, a dry, intense warmth that tightened the skin of your cheeks and made your eyes water, just enough to blur the edges of the flames. You stayed there for a long moment, studying the coals, not with the urgency of a man who must quickly restore a dying fire, but with the calm, assessing gaze of one who understands this small universe of embers and knows exactly what it needs. The fire did not require a large log. A split piece of medium size, placed carefully so that it would catch slowly and burn for hours, was the right offering for this stage of the night. And you had already selected such a piece, now resting at your side, its ends squared by your axe, its bark stripped away to reveal the pale, clean wood beneath. You picked up the log again, this time removing your mitten so that you could feel the full texture of the wood against your bare skin. The grain-like fine ridges, the slight roughness where the axe had torn rather than cut, the cool, dry surface that seemed to pull the moisture from your fingertips even as you held it. The touch was satisfying in a way that was hard to name, a connection between your hand and the material that would soon transform into heat and light, a small, tangible link in the long chain of cause and effect that kept the cabin alive through the frozen months. You positioned the log in your grip, balancing its weight, and then you leaned forward and placed it carefully onto the bed of coals, laying it diagonally across the brightest part of the ember bed so that its underside made contact with the hottest points, while its upper surface remained exposed to the air that would feed the flames once they caught. The log settled into the coals with a soft crunching sound, the ash yielding beneath its weight, the embers shifting and resettling around it, a few sparks rising like tiny brief stars that winked out before they reached the top of the firebox. For a moment, nothing happened. The log sat there, dark and inert, a solid shape against the glowing background, and you could see the fine layer of frost that still clung to its surface from its time near the outer wall, a delicate white fur that began to melt almost immediately, tiny beads of water forming and then vanishing into steam, with a faint, hissing whisper that was barely audible over the low murmur of the stove. Then the wood closest to the coals began to darken, a slow stain of brown that spread upward from the point of contact, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from the surface. Not the thick, acrid smoke of wet wood, but a clean, pale ribbon that carried the sharp scent of resin heating to its boiling point. A smell that filled the cabin with a fresh, invigorating sharpness before it was pulled up the stovepipe and out into the frozen night. The smoke thickened slightly, wavering in the updraft, and then, without any sound at all, a small flame appeared at the edge of the log, a tongue of blue and orange that seemed to hesitate for a second, testing the surface, before it took hold and began to spread with a soft, eager crackle. The flame grew taller, feeding on the gases that the heat was driving out of the wood, and soon the entire underside of the log was alive with a rippling sheet of fire that wrapped around the split surfaces, illuminating the grain of the wood in stark, vivid detail, the lines of the annual rings glowing like the pages of a book written in light. You watched the fire take hold, and as you watched you reached for the damper, a small iron lever set into the stovepipe just above the main body, its handle shaped like a flattened teardrop, cool to the touch because it was far enough from the firebox that the heat had not fully penetrated the metal. The damper controlled the flow of air through the stove, and you had learned through long experience exactly how far to close it to achieve the slow, steady burn that would last for hours without consuming the wood too quickly. Too open, and the fire would roar up in a brief, intense blaze that would fill the cabin with heat only to die down again into cold ash before midnight. Too closed, and the flames would suffocate, the smoke would back up into the room, and the fire would smolder out into a bed of black, dead coals. The right setting was a matter of feel, a balance between air and fuel that your hand seemed to know without any instruction from your mind, a knowledge stored in the muscles and the bones rather than in thought. You pushed the damper handle slowly to the left, watching the flame respond, seeing it steady into a calm, even burn, its flickering reduced to a gentle, almost liquid motion that flowed across the surface of the log, without the frantic energy of an unregulated blaze. The sound of the fire changed too. The crackle softened into a low, purring roar, a continuous sound like a distant waterfall or wind through pines, a sound that was not loud but pervasive, filling the cabin with a steady, comforting presence that seemed to hold the silence together rather than break it. Satisfied with the damper's position, you withdrew your hand and sat back on your heels, your knees pressing into the rug, your gaze still fixed on the fire through the open door, unwilling yet to close it and seal the flames away behind the mica window. The warmth was now more intense than before, radiating directly from the open firebox in broad, generous waves that reached your face and chest and hands, driving the last remnants of the outside cold from your skin. And you felt a deep, involuntary shiver pass through you. Not a shiver of chill, but of release, the body's way of letting go of the tension it had held all day against the freezing air. The log was now fully engulfed, its surface covered in a dancing layer of flame that had deepened in color to a rich, translucent orange, and the fibers of the wood were visible within the fire, black lines that glowed red at their centers, the structure of the tree still present even as it transformed into heat and light and smoke. You could see the flame following the grain, consuming the softer springwood more quickly than the harder summerwood, carving tiny channels and valleys into the surface, and you thought, without forming the thought into words, about the slow, beautiful inevitability of it, the way the tree had grown on a hillside in the brief northern summers, ring by ring, season by season, only to end here in this iron box, giving its stored sunlight back to the world in one long, slow exhalation of warmth. After a time you reached forward and took hold of the door handle again, and you swung the door shut with the same low creak that had announced its opening, the sound now carrying a note of finality, as if the ritual had reached its natural conclusion and the fire could now be left to its private work. The mica window glowed brighter than before, the new log casting a more vigorous light through the translucent mineral, and the flames within were reduced to a soft, shifting glow that pulsed gently against the glass. You straightened up from your crouch, your back stretching with a pleasant ache, and you stood before the stove once more, feeling the heat rise from the iron in steady, invisible currents that wrapped around you like a second coat, a warmth that was dry and clean and carried the faint, pleasant bitterness of the spruce smoke that had escaped before the door was closed. The cabin had grown noticeably warmer in the last few minutes, the air losing its sharp edge, the frost on the inside of the window perhaps retreating a fraction of an inch, though you could not see this from where you stood, and the shadows in the corners of the room had softened, filled now with a gentle golden light that reached farther than the coals alone had managed. The log would burn for 2 hours, maybe 3, and when it had burned down to a bed of fresh coals, you would add another, and then another after that, keeping the rhythm through the long night so that when you finally slept, the fire would still be alive, still glowing, still holding the deep, endless cold of the Klondike winter, at a distance that was never quite safe, but always, for this night at least, sufficient. The warmth of the renewed fire had spread through the small cabin until the air against your cheeks no longer nipped, but simply touched, a gentle, dry presence that invited you to stand still and enjoy the luxury of being indoors after so many hours of wind and frozen silence. Yet even as the room grew comfortable, your body remained encased in the full armor of the day, every limb wrapped in multiple skins of wool and canvas and woven cotton that had shielded you from the 30 below cold outside, but now felt heavy, almost excessive, like a shell you no longer quite needed but had not yet taken the time to shed. You became aware as you stood before the stove with your back to the fire and your face toward the dark window, of the sheer mass of clothing that hung from your shoulders and clung to your legs, the cumulative weight of it pressing down on you in a way that was not unpleasant. Exactly, but that reminded you how long it had been since you had stood in nothing but your own skin and felt the air move freely around your limbs. The sensation rose slowly into your attention, layer by layer. First the outer coat with its thick, dense weave, then the heavy flannel shirt beneath it, then the long johns that covered you from neck to ankle, then the canvas trousers, then the 2 pairs of socks and the tall moose-hide mooklooks that rose to your knees, each piece a separate world of texture and warmth and memory that had wrapped you since early morning when you had dressed by candlelight and stepped out into the frozen dark. You lifted one arm and looked at it, turning your hand over, and you watched the heavy mackinaw sleeve move with you, its rough wool catching the orange light from the stove in 1,000 tiny fibers that glinted like frost. The coat was not a garment you thought about often, because it had become, over the months, simply an extension of your body, a constant companion that you put on without conscious choice and removed only in the final moments before sleep. Now, in the stillness of the evening, you had the leisure to notice it properly, to run your other hand along the sleeve and feel the coarse, oily texture of the wool, the way it resisted your palm with a slight gritty friction that spoke of lanolin and wood smoke and the fine invisible dust of the trail. The coat had been made in a factory somewhere far to the east, in a city whose name you had heard but never visited, and it had travelled by train and stern-wheeler and sled dog before it reached the trading post in Dawson, where you had traded an ounce of gold dust for it, handing over the small leather poke and receiving in return this heavy, shapeless garment that smelled of new wool and machine oil. That had been more than a year ago, and the coat now carried the marks of every day since, a dark stain on the left cuff where you had reached into the stove one too many times, a small tear on the right shoulder that you had mended with a patch of canvas and waxed thread, the elbows worn smooth and shiny from the constant friction of your arms against your body as you worked. The buttons were mismatched, one of them replaced with a wooden toggle you had whittled yourself from a piece of birch, and the buttonholes had stretched and frayed until they gaped slightly, letting in tiny drafts that you had learned to ignore. The collar was lined with a strip of rabbit fur that had once been soft and full, but was now matted into flat, dark clumps that no longer offered much warmth, though you still turned it up against the wind out of habit, tucking your chin into the thin, worn fur, as if the gesture itself could generate heat. You touched the collar now, your bare fingers finding the fur after you had pulled off your mittens and stuffed them into the coat pockets, and you felt the individual hairs, stiff and slightly greasy, a texture that was not pleasant, but deeply familiar. A small rough comfort that had been pressed against your throat through 100 storms. Standing in the quiet cabin with the coat still buttoned to your chin, you felt the heat from the stove begin to build inside the layers, trapping your body's warmth in a moist enclosed space that was beginning to feel stuffy, and the impulse to open the coat, to release the captured heat and let the cooler air of the room reach your chest, grew until you acted on it. Your fingers found the top button, a large disc of blackened brass that was slippery between your thumb and forefinger, and you pushed it through the stretch wall of the buttonhole with a soft, tearing sound, the fibers catching for just a moment before they released. You moved to the next button, and the next, working your way down the front of the coat with the slow automatic movements of a nightly ritual that required no attention, your mind drifting while your hands performed their familiar task. As each button came free, the coat loosened around you, the front panels falling open to reveal the thick flannel shirt beneath, its pattern of red and black checks faded by sun and washing until the colors had bled into one another, leaving a soft brownish blur that was more memory than hue. The shirt had come from the same trading post, purchased not with gold, but with a few worn silver coins that you had carried in your pocket for weeks, and it had been stiff and new, and smelled of the dye when you first put it on, the collar scratching your neck until you had washed it in the creek and beaten it against a rock to soften the fibers. Now it was as soft as old linen, the elbows thin enough to show the long johns beneath, the cuffs frayed into loose threads that wrapped around your wrists like the beginnings of a fringe. Beneath the shirt, the long johns covered you in a single seamless garment of cream-colored wool, its knit tight and elastic enough to cling to every contour of your arms and chest and legs, the fabric worn to a transparent thinness at the knees, and the seat where the pressure of sitting and kneeling had rubbed away the fibers over the months. The long johns had been with you since before you came north, a gift from a sister whose face you could still see if you closed your eyes, and the waistband was now held together with a patch of different wool, lighter in color, that you had stitched in by the light of the kerosene lamp on a night much like this one, the needle dipping in and out of the fabric while the wind howled and the stove ticked. You slit the mackinaw coat off your shoulders, and the sudden release of its weight was so pronounced that you felt for a moment as if you might float upward, your shoulders rising an inch, your spine straightening without the constant downward pressure. The coat came away with a soft rustle of wool against flannel, and you held it in your hands for a moment, the empty garment sagging under its own weight, the sleeves dangling limply toward the floor, the shape of your body, still impressed into the fabric as a ghostly hollow that would fade only after the coat had hung on its peg for a while. The air of the cabin, which had felt warm against your face, now reached your arms through the thinner fabric of the shirt, and you felt a subtle chill rise on your forearms, a coolness that was not cold but refreshing, the skin breathing freely for the first time since morning. You turned and carried the coat to the peg beside the door, the same peg that held your spare coat and the leather pouch of nails, and you hung it carefully, smoothing the collar flat and straightening the sleeves so that they would dry without creasing, a small act of care that you performed not out of any real need, but because the habit of tending to your possessions had been ingrained so deeply that it had become a kind of quiet pleasure. With the coat off, the room felt larger around you, the air more mobile, and you stood for a moment in the center of the floor, rolling your shoulders and feeling the joints move under the looser layers, the stiffness of the day beginning to dissolve into a pleasant spreading looseness that traveled down your arms and into your fingers. The canvas trousers that covered your legs were held up by a pair of suspenders, their elastic long since perished and replaced with strips of leather that you had cut from an old boot. And the trousers themselves were stained with the grey mud of the creek and the brown dust of the cabin floor, their knees patched with squares of denim that you had sewn with the same wax thread that held your coat together. They were heavy, these trousers, their fabric stiff even after months of wear, and the waistband dug into your hips with a familiar, grounding pressure that you had long stopped noticing, but that now, as you stood still, made itself known as a dull ache that would fade as soon as you sat down. Beneath the trousers, the long johns continued down your legs, their cuffs tucked into the tops of your socks, and the socks themselves were a doubled layer of wool. The inner pair thin and close-knit, the outer pair thick and ribbed, their tops folded down over the shafts of your mukluks to seal the gap against the snow. Your feet, encased in all this woolen leather, were warm, almost too warm now that you were indoors, and you could feel the slight dampness of sweat between your toes, a moisture that would cool quickly if you removed the mukluks, but that for now was merely a soft, humid presence, a reminder of the long walk home from the creek. The mukluks themselves were your finest work, the product of several winter evenings spent cutting and stitching by the light of the lamp, and you looked down at them now with a quiet, unspoken satisfaction that came from having made a thing with your own hands that served you well. The soles were cut from thick moose hide, tanned and smoked, until it was hard and dark and nearly waterproof, and the uppers rose in a soft, pliable cylinder of the same material, stitched with sinew that you had split and twisted yourself, the stitches uneven but strong, each one a small knot that held the boot together against the worst the trail could offer. The tops of the mukluks were trimmed with a band of beaver fur that you had traded for in Dawson, the fur still glossy and dense, its tips catching the light in a way that made it seem alive, and the drawstring that tightened the top around your calf was a simple length of rawhide, now darkened by the oil from your fingers. Inside, the mukluks were lined with a thick layer of felt, cut from an old hat that had lost its shape, and the felt had molded itself to the contours of your feet, until the inside of each boot was a perfect negative of your own sole and arch and heel, a custom fit that no store-bought boot could ever match. You decided that it was time to remove the mukluks, to free your feet from their warm, enclosing weight and let them rest. And you crossed to the bunk where you could sit on the edge and unlace them without having to crouch on the floor. The spruce boughs rustled and shifted beneath you as you sat down, releasing a fresh wave of that sharp, clean scent, and you leaned forward to reach the rawhide drawstring of the first mukluk, your fingers finding the knot that had been pulled tight by the day's walking. The knot resisted for a moment, the leather stiff with cold even now, but you worked it loose with patient, gentle tugs, not pulling too hard because you knew that the rawhide was old and might snap, leaving you to fashion a new drawstring in the dark. The knot came undone all at once, the loops falling open, and the top of the mukluk loosened around your calf, letting a small breath of cooler air slip in against the wool of your outer sock. You pulled the boot off with a slow, steady motion, the felt lining sliding against your sock, and your foot emerged into the dim, warm air of the cabin with a sensation of sudden lightness, as if a weight had been lifted not just from your foot, but from your whole leg. You set the mukluk on the floor beside the bunk, its shaft collapsing into a soft heap, and you repeated the process with the second, the knot coming undone more easily this time, the boot sliding off with the same soft, releasing sensation. With both mukluks off, you sat for a moment and looked at your feet, still wrapped in the two pairs of wool socks, the outer socks a dark grey and the inner ones a lighter cream. both pairs damp at the toes and heels, the wool slightly matted and warm to the touch. You wiggled your toes and felt the bones crack softly, a small release of tension that had been building all day, and you decided that the socks, too, could come off, at least the outer pair, so that your feet could dry and cool and breathe. You peeled the outer socks down over your heels and off, the wool holding the shape of your foot for a moment before collapsing into a wrinkled tube, and you laid them across the foot of the bunk to air out, the faint, salty scent of sweat rising from them and mixing with the spruce and the wood smoke. The inner socks you left on, thin and soft and full of small holes that you had darned with finer wool, and you sat back on the bunk, letting your feet hang over the edge, feeling the air move around your toes and the blood begin to circulate more freely now that the constriction of the boots was gone. The cold still found you in the small gaps of your clothing, a tiny draft that crept in at your collar where the flannel shirt hung open, a breath of cooler air that touched the back of your neck when you turned your head, a faint chill at your wrists where the cuffs had stretched and no longer sealed tightly, and you were aware of these small invasions not as discomforts but as gentle reminders of the vast winter that waited outside, pressing against the chinking, testing the window, searching for any way into the warm enclosed space you had made. You pulled the flannel shirt closer around your throat and let your hands rest on your thighs, feeling the texture of the canvas trousers under your palms, the fabric rough and cold in the spots where your body heat had not fully penetrated, and you sat there in the quiet slowly unwinding from the day, layer by layer, memory by memory, until you felt almost weightless, suspended in the soft golden glow of the stove-lit cabin. The shelf was not a grand structure, not a piece of furniture that would have drawn the eye of a visitor had any visitor ever entered this cabin, but it was one of the first things you had built after the walls went up and the roof was laid, and it had served you with a quiet, uncomplaining reliability ever since. It was a single plank of rough pine about 4 feet long and 10 inches wide, its edges still showing the marks of the saw blade that had cut it from a larger log, its surface plane smooth enough to hold a row of provisions without tipping, but not so smooth that a tin could slide on its own. The plank rested on 4 wooden pegs that you had driven into the gaps between the lobs of the wall, each peg a short length of birch branch trimmed to fit snugly into the chinking, and the shelf was positioned high enough that you could see its contents clearly from where you sat on the edge of the bunk. Your feet bare, except for the thin inner socks, your body still wrapped in flannel and canvas and the soft worn wool of your long johns. The stove's orange glow, now steadied by the fresh log you had added, cast a warm, rippling light across the room, and that light fell upon the shelf in a way that illuminated the row of items without harshness, painting them in shades of amber and deep, shadowed brown, so that the blue enamel of the bean tin was almost black, the white cotton of the flour sack a pale, creamy gold, the cheesecloth wrapping of the salt, pork a soft, translucent grey. You let your gaze travel along the shelf from left to right, not with any sense of urgency or purpose, but simply because the items were there, familiar and constant, and the act of looking at them was as natural as looking at the flames in the stove or the frost on the window, a quiet occupation for a mind that had no pressing business to attend to. The first object on the left was the can of ground coffee, a squat, dented cylinder of tinned iron that had once been painted a bright red with gold lettering, though now the paint was scuffed and faded to a faint, rusty blush. The words, unreadable except for a single letter A, that still held its original gilt. The dent in the side of the can had occurred during the journey from Dawson, when the sled had hit a buried root and the entire load had shifted, and you remembered the sound it had made, a dull, hollow thump that you had barely registered over the hiss of the runners on the snow, but the dent did not affect the coffee inside, which was still dry and dark and fragrant, its aroma so potent that even through the sealed tin you could imagine it rising to meet your nose when the lid was pried open. The lid itself was a tight-fitting circle of the same tinned iron, with a small ring set into its center for lifting, and you had learned to open it carefully with the tip of your knife, working the blade around the edge in small, patient increments so that the lid could be pressed back into place afterward, sealing the coffee against the moisture that would otherwise turn it into a solid, black lump. The coffee had come from a trader in Dawson who had imported it from somewhere far to the south, a place where the beans grew on bushes under a hot sun, and you thought about that distant sun now, not with longing, but with a mild, abstract curiosity. The kind of thought that drifts through a quiet mind and then drifts out again, leaving no trace. Beside the coffee can, standing upright and sturdy, was the blue enameled tin of beans, its color so deep and rich that even in the dim light it seemed to hold a piece of the sky, though a sky of a kind you'd not seen in months, the pale, washed-out blue of a summer noon above the creek. The enamel was chipped in several places, revealing the dark iron beneath, and the chips had been sealed with a thin film of grease to prevent rust, a trick you had learned from an old miner on the trail who had also taught you how to sharpen an axe with a file, and how to read the clouds for the approach of a storm. The tin held dried beans, not the canned beans that you could buy in a city store, because dried beans weighed less and lasted longer, and you have measured out the contents of the tin many times in your mind, knowing that a single handful, soaked overnight in cold water and boiled for an hour with a piece of salt pork, made a meal that would sit in your stomach like a warm, solid stone, carrying you through the long morning of work at the creek. The beans were small and white and hard as pebbles when dry, and they rattled with a soft, shushing sound when you tilted the tin, a sound that you associated with the first step of many suppers, the quiet percussion of preparation in the cold cabin. Next in the row was the cotton sack of flour, a simple bag of unbleached muslin that you had sewn yourself from a larger piece of cloth. Its seams double-stitched and the top twisted into a tight knot and secured with a short length of hemp twine that had been tied and untied so many times that the fibers were beginning to fray. The sack was about 3/4 full, its sides bulging softly, its shape conforming to the flour inside like a pillow that had been used enough to take the impression of a head, and the flour itself was a fine white powder that you had purchased in Dawson after sifting through several sacks at the trader's store to find one that was free of weevils and mold. The flour was your most versatile provision, the base for biscuits and bannock, and the occasional pan of fried dough that you made when the mood struck you, and you treated it with a particular care, always making sure that the sack was tightly closed and kept away from the damp air near the door. A fine dusting of flour had settled on the plank beneath the sack, a thin, white bloom that you would wipe away with a damp cloth some day, though not tonight, because tonight was not for cleaning, but for sitting still and letting the night pass around you in its slow, inevitable way. Beside the flour, on a small tin plate that served as its designated resting place, lay the slab of salt pork, a rectangular chunk of fat and lean meat that had been cured in a heavy brine until it was nearly indestructible, capable of lasting for months without spoiling even in the relative warmth of the cabin. The salt pork was wrapped loosely in a piece of cheesecloth that had turned yellow from the grease that had seeped into its fibers, and the cloth was spotted with tiny crystals of salt that glittered in the stove-light like fragments of mica. When you lifted the cloth, which you did not need to do now but could easily imagine, the surface of the pork was revealed as a pale, pinkish white, marbled with lines of darker meat, and the smell was sharp and saline and slightly smoky, a smell that made your mouth water in a reflexive, bodily way, even when you were not hungry. You used the salt pork sparingly, slicing off a thin piece with the bone-handled knife and adding it to the beans or the dough, and the fat that rendered out was saved in a small tin cup for frying or for greasing the pan, because nothing was wasted, nothing could be wasted. In a place where every ounce of provision had been carried on your back or dragged on a sled across miles of frozen river and through stands of black spruce that seemed to go on forever. The final item on the shelf, tucked into the right-hand corner where the plank met the log wall, was the paper packet of baking powder, a small square envelope of waxed paper that had been folded with the kind of precision that spoke of a factory machine, the creases still sharp despite the months of handling. The packet was light, almost weightless, and when you picked it up you could feel the fine white powder shift inside with a soft, sliding sensation, a material so dry and fine that it seemed to want to escape into the air and drift away like smoke. Baking powder was a luxury of sorts, not because it was expensive, though it had cost a fair amount at the trading post, but because it turned the dense, heavy flour and water dough into something that rose and puffed and had a texture that was closer to bread than to stone, a small chemical miracle that you still did not fully understand, but accepted with gratitude each time you stirred a pinch into the flour. The packet was still more than half full, its contents measured out in careful teaspoons, each one a tiny white mound that fizzed and bubbled when it touched water, and you had learned to keep the packet sealed with a small wooden clothespin that you had carved for this exact purpose, its two halves pinching the folded top of the paper, closed with a firm, steady pressure. Having let your eyes rest on each item in turn, you began the slow, quiet work of tallying the supplies, a mental inventory that you performed not out of anxiety but out of habit, the same way you checked the damper on the stove or the latch on the door before sleeping, a ritual that reassured you with its predictability. You knew without counting exactly how many beans remained in the tin, because you had poured them out on the table 2 nights ago and counted them one by one, arranging them in rows of 10 until the whole tin was accounted for and the number had been a comfortable one, sufficient for many more meals. The flour sack, when hefted in your hand, gave you a weight that you translated into an approximate number of biscuits, a calculation that was rough but reliable based on the many times you had scooped out a cup of the white powder and watched it mound above the rim before you leveled it with the back of the knife. The salt pork, with its dense, solid mass, would last even longer, because a single thin slice could flavor an entire pot of beans or fry up into crisp, salty bits that you would scatter over a pan of dough, and the slab still had the thickness of a large book, its edges only slightly reduced from their original dimensions. The coffee was the one item that you measured most carefully, because it was the one that you could not do without for more than a morning without feeling a dull, nagging absence behind your eyes. And you had learned to grind only enough for 2 cups at a time using the small brass grinder that sat in the corner of the shelf, its handle worn smooth and its burrs still sharp enough to reduce the beans to a fine dark powder that smelled of earth and toast and distant countries. The supply run to Dawson was a journey that you made 3 or 4 times a winter, whenever the cash grew low enough that the next 2 weeks of eating would be meager without replenishment, and you had learned to time these trips with a careful attention to the weather and the state of the trail, because a sudden blizzard or a thaw that turned the river ice to slush could make the journey impossible for days or weeks. The trail wound along the frozen creek bed for most of its length, then climbed over a low ridge and descended into the valley, where the town huddled along the banks of the Klondike, its buildings a jumble of log cabins and canvas tents and false-fronted stores that had sprung up so quickly they seemed almost to have risen out of the mud overnight. The walk took 2 days in good conditions, 3 if the snow was deep and soft, and you always made the trip with a light pack on the way out, carrying only enough food for the journey, because the return trip would be loaded with the new supplies, the heavy sack of flour and the tins of beans, and the side of bacon and the small luxuries like the packet of baking powder or a tin of condensed milk that you would allow yourself once in a while as a treat. The journey was not something you dreaded or anticipated with any strong feeling. It was simply a part of the rhythm of your life, as regular and unremarkable as the rising of the sun or the falling of the snow, a task that had to be done and that you did without complaint or celebration. Tonight, as you sat on the bunk and looked at the shelf, you calculated that the current supplies would last for perhaps 2 more weeks, maybe a little longer if you were careful with the flour and stretched the beans into thinner soups, and this meant that the next trip to Dawson would not be necessary until the moon had passed through its next phase and begun to wane again, a stretch of time that felt in this quiet moment as vast and unhurried as the forest itself. There was a comfort in this knowledge, a deep, quiet reassurance that came from knowing that the shelf held enough, that the cabin was warm, that the fire was burning steadily in the stove, and that the frozen night outside could howl and drift and press against the walls as much as it wanted, because inside there was sufficiency, a word that you had come to understand in a new way since you had arrived in this country, a word that meant not abundance, but simply enough, and enough was all that anyone could ask for. You let your gaze drift away from the shelf and across the cabin, taking in the other signs of provision that filled the small room, the pile of split spruce beside the stove, the water bucket with its thin skin of ice, the spare candles on the shelf above the bunk, the axe and the saw and the shovel that leaned in their corner, each a tool that had its purpose and its place. The cabin itself was a kind of shelf, You thought, without putting the thought into words, a container that held everything you needed to survive, and you were the keeper of that container, the one who counted and arranged and replenished, and this role, this quiet, daily stewardship of the small and the necessary, was as close to contentment as you had ever come. Outside, the snow continued to fall, piling silently against the window and the door, sealing the cabin in a white cocoon that would remain unbroken until morning, and you sat in the golden glow of the stove and let the slow tally of supplies fade from your mind, leaving behind only the soft, steady awareness that all was well, that the shelf was full, that the night could proceed as it always did, one quiet hour at a time. Beside the shelf, on a wooden peg that you had driven into the log wall long ago when the cabin was still new and the chinking was still soft and fragrant with the smell of wet moss, hung the gold pan, its wide, shallow cone of steel catching the orange light from the stove in a way that made the metal glow with a dull, muted sheen, the color of a cloudy sunset reflected on still water. The peg itself was a piece of birch branch, cut to a length of about 4 inches and whittled smooth on one end so that it would slide easily into the gap between the logs, while the other end still bore a small patch of the white, papery bark that peeled away in thin, curling strips when you touched it. The pan had hung there for months now, ever since the first hard freeze had locked the creek under ice and made the work of the summer impossible to continue, and it had become a part of the wall's landscape, as familiar and unremarkable as the axe or the water bucket or the spare coat, something that your eyes passed over a dozen times a day without any particular recognition. But tonight, with the cabin quiet and the fire settled into its long, slow burn, your gaze found the pan and lingered on it, tracing the wide circle of its rim, the sloping sides that descended to a flat bottom no wider than a dinner plate, and the handle that was nothing more than a small loop of iron wire attached to one edge, bent and twisted by the grip of your hand over countless hours. The steel of the pan was dark, not the bright silvery grey of new metal, but a deep mottled charcoal that came from years of exposure to water and air and the fine, abrasive grit of the creek bed, a patina that had formed slowly, imperceptibly, like the weathering of a stone. The surface was not smooth. It was covered in scratches, thousands of them, a dense overlapping web of fine lines that spiraled outward from the center in concentric circles, each scratch a record of a single swirl of your wrist, a single moment of the repetitive motion that had filled your days from the first thaw of spring until the first snow of autumn. The scratches caught the light differently depending on their depth and angle, some reflecting a thin, bright line while others absorbed the glow into their dark grooves, and the overall effect was of a kind of writing, a script that no one could read but that told the story of your labor in a language of metal and motion. Around the rim, where the sides of the pan curled over into a rounded lip, the steel was smoother and shinier, polished by the constant friction of your hands, and you could see the faint ghostly reflection of the stove's mica window in that polished band, a tiny distorted square of orange that wavered as your own breathing shifted the air. In the crease where the sloping side met the flat bottom of the pan, a few specks of gold dust still lay trapped, too fine and too few to bother with a clean-up, their presence a quiet, accidental souvenir of the last day you had worked the gravel before the freeze. You had swirled the pan that final afternoon, your fingers numb and blue, and when you had tipped the water out and let the black sand slide across the steel, those tiny flakes had caught in the corner and stayed there, held by the faint, microscopic roughness of the metal, and you had noticed them and decided to leave them where they were, a small golden residue that would wait out the winter in the warm, dry air of the cabin. They glittered now in the stovelight, just a few points of yellow that winked and disappeared and winked again as the flames behind the mica rose and fell, and the sight of them was pleasant in a distant, abstract way, like finding a forgotten coin in the pocket of an old coat, a small, quiet reminder of a season that had passed and would, in the fullness of time, return again. The memory of the summer creek came to you not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, gradual unfolding, a series of images and sensations that drifted through your mind like the smoke from the stovepipe drifting across the snow outside, unhurried and without any particular destination. You remembered the sound of the water first because the sound of the creek was the background of every summer day, a constant, low rush that filled the valley and made it impossible to hear anything else, a sound that you stopped noticing after a while, but that you always noticed again when you paused in your work and lifted your head and let it wash over you like the water itself washing over the stones. The creek was not a large river, not the kind of broad, powerful current that could sweep a man off his feet and carry him downstream, but a modest, shallow stream that ran over a bed of gravel and cobblestones, its water clear as glass and cold as the melting snow that fed it from the high ridges above. It fell in a series of small rapids and quiet pools, the rapids foaming white over the larger rocks, while the pools lay still and deep and dark, their surfaces reflecting the sky and the spruce trees and the occasional cloud that passed overhead. You had worked in one of the quieter stretches, a place where the water was shallow enough to wade in and the gravel bars extended out into the stream like the fingers of a buried hand, and you had spent the long, endless days of the northern summer standing in that water, bending over the pan, moving the gravel and the sand in the slow, patient dance that was the whole purpose of your being there. The cold of the water was a thing that you remembered in your body more than in your mind, a sensation that had become so deeply ingrained over the months that you could still feel it if you closed your eyes and let your attention sink down into your hands and feet. It began as a sharp, biting shock when you first stepped into the creek in the morning, the chill driving up through the soles of your boots and into your bones, and then it settled into a deep, persistent ache that numbed your toes and your fingers and made your knuckles stiff and slow. Your hands plunged again and again into the freezing water as you dipped the pan and swirled the gravel, would turn a mottled red and then a pale, bloodless white, and the sensation of touch would become distant and unreliable, so that you could not feel the texture of the sand or the weight of the pebbles, but only a general, vague pressure that told you the pan was still full. You wore thin leather gloves sometimes, and they helped for the first few minutes, but the water soaked through them quickly, and then they became just another layer of cold clinging to your skin and making your fingers feel thick and clumsy. Yet you kept working, not from any heroic determination but simply because stopping would not make the water any warmer, and because the motion itself, the steady circular swirl of the pan, generated a tiny amount of heat from the friction of your muscles, enough to keep the worst of the chill at bay, but never enough to make you truly comfortable. The technique of the pan was something that you had learned gradually, through trial and error and the patient observation of other miners on the creek, and by the end of the first summer it had become so automatic that you could perform it without any conscious thought, your hands moving through the sequence while your mind drifted elsewhere, lost in the sound of the water and the rhythm of the day. You would begin by filling the pan with gravel from the creek bed, scooping it up from a spot where the current had slowed and the heavier materials had settled, and the weight of the pan would increase suddenly, the steel rim biting into your palms as you lifted it free of the water and let the excess drain away. Then you would submerge the pan again, just enough to cover the gravel, and you would begin to swirl it, a gentle circular motion that set the water and the gravel spinning together in a slow, liquid vortex. The lighter materials, the sand and the small pebbles and the fragments of organic matter, would rise to the surface and begin to spill out over the rim, carried away by the water, while the heavier materials, the black sand and the iron and, if you were fortunate, the gold, would sink to the bottom and stay there, trapped by their own density. You would continue swirling, tipping the pan slightly, letting the water carry away more and more of the lighter material, and gradually the contents of the pan would reduce from a full load of mixed gravel to a thin layer of dark, concentrated sand that covered the bottom like a layer of wet velvet. And then, with the pan tilted at just the right angle and the water washing gently across the surface, you would see the gold appear, tiny flecks and specks, and occasionally a small, irregular nugget, their yellow brightness unmistakable against the black background, a color that seemed to glow with its own inner light even on the cloudiest of days. The gold was always a surprise, no matter how many times you saw it, not because it was exciting, but because there was something quietly miraculous about the way it separated itself from everything else, the way it emerged from the gray, indistinguishable gravel as if it had been hiding there all along, waiting for the right motion to reveal it. The flakes were rarely large. Most were no bigger than a grain of sand, so tiny that you had to tilt the pan into the sunlight and squint to see them, and the nuggets were few and far between, small, lumpy pieces that felt heavy and cool in your palm, and that you would slip into the small leather poke around your neck without ceremony. You never felt any great surge of emotion at the sight of the gold, not after the first few weeks, because the gold was simply the result, the logical outcome of the process, the reason you stood in the freezing water and swirled the pan, and it would have been strange to feel excitement every time, because the process itself was so slow and so repetitive that it absorbed all strong feelings and smoothed them away into a calm, steady acceptance. The gold was just there, a small, quiet fact at the end of the day, and you would weigh it on the little brass scale in the cabin and record the weight in a notebook with a stub of pencil. And then you would pour it into the larger jar that sat on the shelf, where it accumulated slowly, gram by gram, week by week, a growing hoard that was never quite enough to make you rich, but always enough to keep you supplied with beans and flour and coffee. The long sun of the northern summer was another thing that you remembered with a kind of hazy, golden clarity. The way the daylight stretched on until the concept of night became almost meaningless. The sky never truly darkening, but only fading to a soft lavender twilight that lasted for an hour or two before the sun rose again, climbing back over the ridges with a slow pink dawn that seemed to apologize for its brief absence. You would work through those endless days without any sense of time, your body finding its own rhythm, your hunger telling you when to stop and eat, your fatigue telling you when to rest, and the clock on the shelf in the cabin became a relic of another world, its hands frozen at some forgotten hour, because you had neglected to wind it. The sun would circle around the sky, never directly overhead but always sliding along the southern horizon in a low, slanting arc, and the light was a constant golden presence that made everything look soft and warm, even the cold water of the creek, even the grey gravel and the dark spruce and the distant snow-covered peaks. The mosquitoes would come in clouds during the stillest hours, their high, whining drone filling the air, and you would smear your face and hands with a greasy, foul-smelling salve that kept them at bay, and you would keep working, your hands swirling the pan, your eyes watching for the glint of gold, your mind empty and still and at peace with the long, repetitive labor that filled the days. Now, in the deep, dark heart of winter, with the snow piled high against the window and the fire ticking softly in the stove, that summer world seemed so distant that it might have been a dream, a story that had happened to someone else, in a place that no longer existed except in the scratches on the gold pan and the few specks of dust that clung to the crease. You rose from the bunk and crossed the room, your bare feet silent on the planks, the inner socks muffling the sound of your steps, and you stood before the peg and looked at the pan from close up, seeing the details that were invisible from across the room, the tiny pits of rust that had begun to form near the handle, the faint, hazy reflection of your own face in the polished rim, the way the steel felt cool to the touch when you reached out and rested a single finger on the edge. The pan was not just a tool, it was a record, a diary written in metal, and it would hang there all winter, gathering dust and the faint, smoky residue of the cabin, until the spring thaw came and the ice on the creek began to groan and crack, and the water started flowing again, and you would take it down and carry it back to the gravel bar and begin the whole cycle over. The same motions, the same cold, the same slow, patient accumulation of gold and days. The window was set into the wall opposite the stove, a single square of glass no larger than a bread pan, its wooden frame rough and splintered, the joints at the corners opening slightly with the dry winter air, so that a whisper of cold seeped through even when the sash was fully closed. You had cut the opening yourself in the first week of building the cabin, using the saw and then the axe to chop through the logs after they were laid, and you had fitted the window frame into the gap with wooden pegs and a thick paste of mud and moss that had dried to a hard grey seal around the edges. The glass itself was wavy and imperfect, full of small bubbles and ripples that distorted the world outside into a shifting, liquid scene, and it had been salvaged from an abandoned cabin farther up the valley, carried back on your shoulder through a snowstorm, wrapped in your spare shirt to protect it from the jostling of the trail. Now, in the deep cold of the winter night, the glass was entirely covered by frost, a thick, white layer of crystalline growth that had bloomed across the surface like a garden of ice, feathery and intricate and utterly silent. The frost had begun forming in the late afternoon when the outside temperature had dropped faster than the stove could warm the inner air, and the moisture that lingered in the cabin from your breath and the simmering beans and the damp wool of your socks had condensed on the coldest surface in the room. At first it had been only a faint haze, a cloudy film that blurred the dark shapes of the spruce trees outside into soft, indistinct shadows. But as the hours passed and the cold deepened, the haze had thickened and crystallized, sending out tiny branching arms that grew and divided and grew again, building themselves into a dense white thicket of frozen vapor. Now the frost ferns, as you had come to call them in the privacy of your own thoughts, covered every inch of the glass from corner to corner, their fronds curling and overlapping in a pattern that was both random and orderly, like the veins of a leaf or the tributaries of a river seen from a great height. The individual crystals were so fine that they seemed to be made of nothing but light and cold, their edges sharp and glittering, their surfaces catching the orange glow of the stove and breaking it into 1,000 tiny sparks that winked and shimmered as you moved your head. You crossed the room to stand before the window, your bare feet pressing into the cool floorboards, the inner socks providing just enough insulation to keep the chill from being uncomfortable, and you leaned close to the glass, close enough that your breath would have fogged it further if the frost had not already claimed the entire surface. Up close, the frost ferns revealed their deeper structure, a complex, three-dimensional architecture of ice that rose from the glass in ridges and spines and delicate hollow tubes, some of them standing out from the surface by 1/4 of an inch or more, their tips branching into even finer structures that were too small to see clearly but that caught the light in a soft, diffuse halo. The crystals grew in clusters, each cluster a small, independent colony that had started from a single point, a tiny speck of dust or a scratch on the glass that had given the water molecules something to cling to. And from that nucleus the ice had spread outward in all directions, following the microscopic contours of the glass, building layer upon layer in a slow, silent construction that had taken all evening to reach its current state. The patterns reminded you of the ferns that grew in the damp, shaded hollows of the forest in summer, their green fronds uncurling from tight, hairy spirals into broad, lacy fans, and the resemblance was so strong that it seemed almost intentional, as if the frost were remembering the shape of the living plant and reproducing it in a different medium, a ghost of summer preserved in ice. Beyond the frost, invisible but still present, the snow continued to fall, a steady, silent drift of flakes that had been coming down since mid-afternoon and showed no sign of stopping. You could not see the snow directly, because the frost was too thick to allow any clear view of the outside world, but you could sense its presence in the quality of the darkness beyond the window, a darkness that was not the deep, transparent black of a clear night, but a softer, more opaque darkness, a darkness filled with the slow, constant motion of millions of falling crystals. The snow was piling up against the outside of the window, you knew, building a small white berm that crept higher with each passing hour, sealing the lower edge of the sash in a blanket of insulation that would help keep the warmth inside. The weight of the snow was also settling onto the roof, pressing down on the poles and the sod with a gentle, even pressure that made the rafters creak softly from time to time, a sound that was so familiar that you no longer heard it as a separate event, but simply as a part of the cabin's breathing, another voice in the quiet chorus of the winter night. The snow would continue falling until the clouds had emptied themselves, and then the sky would clear and the temperature would drop even further. The stars would come out, sharp and bright as pinpricks in a black cloth, and the moonlight would reflect off the fresh white surface of the valley until the world outside was almost as bright as day. Though a day drained of all color, a day made only of silver and shadow and the long blue shapes of the trees. You reached up and pressed the tip of your finger against the frost, not hard enough to break the glass, but firmly enough to feel the cold radiate through the skin and into the bone beneath. A sharp, immediate sensation that was almost like touching a hot surface, the nerve endings unable to distinguish for a moment between the extremes of heat and cold. The frost melted under the warmth of your finger, the crystals collapsing into a tiny clear circle of water that refroze almost instantly when you pulled your hand away, leaving behind a small round mark like a fingerprint made of ice, a record of your presence that would remain until the sun or the stove or the slow, sublimating work of the dry air erased it. You looked at that mark for a long moment, the tiny, transparent window within the larger, frosty window, and through it you could just make out the faint shape of the spruce trees beyond, their branches heavy with snow, their trunks dark and straight and motionless in the still, frozen air. The trees stood in a dense black wall around the cabin, their tops lost in the falling snow, their roots buried deep under the drifts, and they seemed to you in that quiet moment like a silent audience that had gathered to watch the cabin through the long night, patient and indifferent and utterly without malice. The cold that pulsed through your finger was a direct physical connection to the world outside, a world that was vast and frozen and almost unimaginably inhospitable, and yet you felt no fear or unease as you stood there, because the cabin was solid around you, the fire was burning in the stove, the shelf was full of provisions, and the window, for all its thinness and fragility, was doing its job, holding the cold at bay while still allowing you to reach out and touch it, to acknowledge it, to talk to it, the frost itself was a kind of seal, a natural barrier that grew thicker and stronger as the night went on, adding its own insulation to the glass, and you knew from experience that by morning the frost would be so thick that no amount of breath or warmth from the stove would melt it, and the window would remain a white, opaque square until the sun rose high enough to strike it directly and begin the slow work of thawing. But morning was still many hours away, a distant, hypothetical time that had no bearing on the present moment, and the present moment was all that existed. The cold glass under your fingertip, the feathery frost spreading across the pane, the snow falling in the darkness beyond, the fire ticking softly behind you, the cabin holding its warmth like a cupped hand around a candle flame. You withdrew your finger from the glass and tucked your hand into the pocket of your canvas trousers, feeling the residual cold slowly fade as your body heat seeped back into the skin. And you remained standing before the window, your breath forming a faint, pale mist that joined the frost and added its own small contribution to the crystalline garden. Through the tiny circle of melted ice, you watched the snow fall, or rather you sensed it falling, the flakes invisible as individuals but present as a slow downward drift in the darkness, a motion that was more like a feeling than a sight, like watching the hour hand of a clock move, too slow to perceive, but impossible to doubt. The snow fell on the roof and the trees and the frozen creek and the gravel bars where you had worked all summer, burying them deeper and deeper under a layer of clean, white silence, erasing the shapes of the land and the marks of your labor and the paths you had worn between the creek and the cabin, leaving everything smooth and featureless and new. In the spring the snow would melt, and the water would run, and the creek would rise, and the gold would shift and settle and wait for you to find it again. But in the meantime, the snow had its own work to do, and it did it without hurry, without noise, without any need for your attention or approval. You turned away from the window and let the frost reclaim the small circle of clarity, the cold sealing the glass over again in a matter of seconds, the crystals growing back with a speed that was almost eager, filling the gap with new fronds and ridges that would, in time, become indistinguishable from the older growth around them. The window became once more a white, opaque square, a blank canvas of ice, and the outside world withdrew into its snowy darkness, leaving you alone with the stove and the shelf and the bunk and the gold pan and the small, warm, enclosed space that was, for this night and for many nights to come, the entire world. The sounds of the cabin had by now settled into a pattern so familiar that you had almost stopped hearing them. The soft, steady tick of the stove as the iron expanded and contracted with the heat, the occasional hiss of a pocket of resin igniting inside the spruce log and then dying away, the faint rustle of the spruce boughs on the bunk when you shifted your weight. These were the sounds of the indoors, the small, intimate voices of a space that was lived in and warm and entirely yours, and they wrapped around you like a blanket of quiet that asked for nothing and expected nothing. But beyond those close, comfortable sounds, beyond the log walls and the chinking and the frost-covered window, there was another sound, a sound that came and went like the breathing of the valley itself, and it was this sound that now began to draw your attention away from the stove and the shelf and the gold pan and pull it outward, into the vast, dark, frozen night that surrounded the cabin on every side. The wind had risen, dark, frozen night that surrounded the cabin on every side. The wind. At first it was only a low, distant murmur, a sound so faint that you might have mistaken it for the rush of your own blood in your ears if you had not known better. A sound that came from somewhere high up among the ridges and the black spruce, like a voice that was trying to speak but could not quite find the words. It was a long, slow exhalation, a sigh that began deep in the forest and traveled down the slopes and across the frozen creek bed, gathering itself as it came, pressing against the trees and the snow and the empty air, until it reached the cabin and wrapped itself around the logs with a soft, insistent pressure that you could feel as much as hear. The sound rose and fell in a slow, irregular rhythm, climbing to a low, mournful note that hovered at the edge of audibility and then fading away into a silence so complete that the silence itself seemed to ring, a hollow, waiting stillness that lasted for a breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths, before the next gust of gathered and came again. It was a sound that had no urgency, no anger, no intention. It was simply the voice of the winter night, the sound of cold air moving across a cold land, and it had been there long before you arrived and would be there long after you were gone. You stood still in the center of the room, your bare feet on the braided rug, your hands resting loosely at your sides, and you let the wind fill your ears and your mind, not fighting it, not analyzing it, just receiving it as it came. The cabin around you seemed to respond to the wind's presence, not with any dramatic movement, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in its posture, a tightening of the joints where the logs met the corner notches, a faint vibration that traveled through the floorboards and into the soles of your feet. The logs themselves, those thick, heavy trunks of spruce that you had cut and hauled and shaped with your own hands, absorbed the wind's pressure like a ship's hull absorbing the push of a wave, creaking softly as they adjusted to the load, their fibers compressing and releasing in a slow, elastic rhythm that was too slow to see but not too slow to sense. The chinking between the logs, that mixture of dried mud and moss and a few scraps of old cloth that you had packed into the gaps during the autumn, was not entirely airtight, and as the wind pressed against the walls, you could hear the tiny, high-pitched whisper of air moving through the narrowest cracks, a sound like a distant flute played by lips too small to see. It was not a draft that you could feel on your skin, not yet, but it was a sound that reminded you of the thinness of the barrier between yourself and the frozen world outside, a sound that spoke of the constant, patient effort of the cold to find a way in. You moved toward the wall nearest the bunk, the one that faced the creek and bore the full force of the wind whenever it blew from the northwest, as it was blowing tonight, and you placed your palm flat against one of the logs, feeling the cool, rough surface under your hand, the grain of the wood like the ridges of a fossilized landscape, the small knots and whorls and the places where the bark had been stripped away and the pale, smooth cambium had darkened with age. The log was cold to the touch, but not freezing, its inner surface warmed by the stove's heat that had soaked into the wood over the many hours of the evening, and you could feel the faint vibration of the wind passing through the log's mass, a vibration that was more like a hum than a shake, a low, steady drone that seemed to come from deep inside the wood itself, as if the tree that the log had once was still alive and still singing, in some distant, diminished way, the song of the forest. You kept your hand there for a long moment, your palm absorbing the subtle, rhythmic pulse of the wind, and you closed your eyes and let the sound of the chinking whisper blend with the sound of the stove and the sound of your own slow, even breathing, until all the sounds merged into a single, seamless texture, a fabric woven from the threads of the indoors and the outdoors, the warm and the cold, the living and the inanimate. The wind would sometimes pause, not gradually, but all at once, as if a great door had been closed somewhere in the sky, and in that sudden absence of sound, the silence would rush in like water filling a hole, dense and complete and almost shocking in its depth. You could hear in those silences the tiny sounds that the wind had been covering, the tick of the stove, the rustle of the spruce boughs, the soft, moist sound of your own swallowing, the faint, distant creak of a tree limb somewhere out in the forest bending under its load of snow. These small sounds seemed to expand in the silence, taking on a clarity and a significance that they did not possess when the wind was blowing, and you listened to them with a kind of quiet attention, not because they were important, but because they were there, and because the act of listening was, in itself, a kind of rest, a way of being present in the moment, without any need to do or think or plan. Then the wind would return, sometimes with a sudden gust that rattled the loose plank by the door and sent a brief cold draught swirling across the floor, and sometimes with a slow, gradual rebuilding that began as a distant murmur and grew louder and deeper and more insistent, until it was once again the dominant sound in the room, filling every corner and every crevice with its low, mournful voice. The roof above you was another source of sound, a part of the cabin's response to the wind that you had come to know as intimately as the voice of a friend. The roof was made of poles laid side by side, their ends resting on the top lobs of the walls, and over the poles you had spread a thick layer of spruce boughs and then a layer of sod that you had cut from the meadow up the valley, and over that the snow had piled up in a dense, heavy blanket that was now perhaps 2 feet thick and still growing. The weight of the snow pressed down on the poles with a steady, patient pressure, and as the wind blew and the temperature shifted, the poles would sometimes release that pressure with a soft, deep creak, a sound that came from nowhere and everywhere, a sound that seemed to originate in the wood itself and then spread outward through the whole structure of the cabin like a ripple spreading across a pond. The creak would come without any warning, a single low note that hung in the air for a moment and then faded away, leaving behind only the memory of its occurrence, and you would listen for it to come again, but it would not come on any predictable schedule, choosing its own time and its own rhythm. A sound as random and as natural as the falling of a pine cone or the cracking of ice on the creek. When the roof creaked, you would sometimes glance upward, even though there was nothing to see in the darkness above the rafters, nothing but the rough undersides of the poles and the patches of sod that had dried and crumbled and occasionally dropped a fine dusty snow of soil onto the floor. The sound was reassuring in its own way, a sign that the roof was doing what it was meant to do, bearing the load of the snow and the wind and the long, slow passage of the winter without complaint. And you would nod slightly to yourself, a small, private acknowledgement of the cabin's strength and patience, before returning your attention to the fire or the shelf or the simple empty space of the evening. The creak was not a sound of distress but a sound of work, the sound of a structure settling into its role as a shelter, a sound that said that everything was holding, that the logs and the poles and the chinking and the sod were all doing their jobs, and that you could sit in the warmth and listen without any need to worry or intervene. You returned to the bunk and sat down, the spruce boughs rustling under you in their familiar aromatic way, and you leaned back against the wall, pulling the wool blanket up over your legs, though you were not yet cold enough to need it, simply because the weight of the blanket was comforting, and because the gesture of covering yourself was a part of the slow winding down process that led eventually to sleep. From this position, with your back against the logs and your eyes half closed, the sounds of the wind and the cabin seemed to arrange themselves into a kind of music, a slow, irregular composition that had no melody and no rhythm, but that nevertheless possessed a kind of coherence, a logic that was felt rather than understood. The long, low exhale of the wind through the spruce outside, the whisper of air through the chinking, the tick of the stove, the creak of the roof, the soft, steady sound of your own breathing, these were the instruments in an orchestra that played the same piece every night, a piece that had no beginning and no end and no name, a piece that was simply the sound of the winter, the sound of the north, the sound of a man alone in a cabin at the edge of the world. You let your eyes close fully now, not because you were ready to sleep, but because the darkness inside your eyelids was a different kind of darkness, softer and warmer than the darkness of the room, and because closing your eyes made the sounds sharper and more distinct, as if the loss of sight had given your ears a new, more sensitive attention. The wind continued its slow, irregular breathing, pressing and releasing, and the chinking whispered its tiny, high-pitched reply, and the stove ticked on, steady as a heartbeat, and the roof creaked once, twice, and then was silent for a long stretch during which the only sound was the wind and the whisper and the tick in your breath, all of them woven together into a tapestry of sound that was as peaceful as any silence could ever be. You did not need to do anything, to add a log to the fire, or trim the lamp, or check the door latch. You could simply sit here, wrapped in the wool blanket, listening to the wind and the cabin and the long, slow passage of the frozen night, waiting for nothing in particular, expecting nothing, content to let the hours pass in this quiet, attentive stillness. The wind would blow and then it would stop. The roof would creak and then it would rest. The stove would tick and then it would fall silent. And through it all you would remain, a quiet, listening presence in the center of the small, warm room. A part of the night as much as the wind itself, as much as the trees that stood outside in the dark, with their branches heavy and their roots deep in the frozen ground. The kerosene lamp had been waiting on the table all evening, unlit and patient, its brass base catching the orange glow of the stove in a dull, muted shimmer that was more like the memory of light than light itself. You had moved around it several times since he came in from the cold, your hand brushing past its chimney when you reached for the tin plate, your elbow casting a shadow across its globe when you stood to hang your coat. But you had not yet reached for the small box of matches that sat beside it, nor had you lifted the chimney to inspect the wick or check the level of the fuel in the reservoir below. The stove's glow had been sufficient for everything you needed to do, sufficient for tending the fire and studying the shelf and tracing the scratches on the gold pan and standing before the frost-covered window while the wind breathed against the logs. But now, with the long night settled fully around the cabin and the wind doing its slow, patient work outside, you felt the quiet pull of the lamp as a kind of invitation, a promise of a different quality of light, a warmer and more intimate circle of illumination that would shrink the cabin from a dark, shadowy cabin into a small golden room. You crossed the short distance from the bunk to the table, your bare feet quiet on the floorboards, the inner socks still soft and warm against your toes, and you stood looking down at the lamp with the kind of attention that you might give to an old tool, an object whose every detail you knew but whose presence still held a small, quiet pleasure. The lamp was not a fine thing, not a piece of craftsmanship that would have drawn any notice in a city store among shelves of polished goods. It was a simple, practical device made of tarnished brass and clear glass, its shape the basic, functional shape of 1,000 other lamps that burned in cabins and tents and shacks all through the goldfields, from the headwaters of the Klondike down to the muddy streets of Dawson. The base was a shallow, round reservoir that held the kerosene, its sides dented in 2 places where it had been knocked over or dropped during some forgotten moment of the past, and the metal was dark with age and handling, a deep brownish gold that had lost any shine it might once have possessed and now absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. The filler cap was a small, knurled knob on the side of the reservoir, its edges worn smooth by the grip of many fingers, and beneath it a thin gasket of leather kept the kerosene from seeping out, though a faint, dark stain around the cap showed where a few drops had escaped over the months and dried into a sticky, aromatic residue that smelled more intensely of the fuel itself. The wick mechanism rose from the center of the reservoir in a narrow brass tube, its top fitted with a toothed wheel that turned when you twisted the small key on the side, raising or lowering the wick in tiny, precise increments. And the wick itself was a flat, woven strip of cotton, its top edge charred black from countless lightings and trimmings, its lower end disappearing into the dark amber-color cyan that trimmings, its lower end disappearing into the dark amber-colored slicings and trimmings. The glass chimney sat atop the wick mechanism, a clear, cylindrical tube that tapered slightly at the top and flared at the bottom where it fitted into a slotted brass collar, and you reached out and lifted the chimney carefully, your fingers gripping the cool, smooth glass just above the flare, feeling its fragility, its thinness, the way the glass seemed almost to weigh nothing at all. The chimney came away with a soft, slight scraping sound as it released from the collar, and you set it on the table beside the lamp, where it caught the stove light and threw a faint, curved reflection onto the wood, a ghostly, transparent shape like a bubble of light that had settled on the surface. With the chimney removed, the wick stood exposed, a small, dark tongue of woven cotton that was slightly frayed at the top, its fibers uneven and crusted with a tiny black bead of carbon, the remnant of the last flame that had burned there. You took the small pair of scissors that you kept in the tin box on the shelf, the same scissors that you used to trim your mustache and cut the cheesecloth for the salt pork, and you leaned close to the wick, your eyes focusing on the charred edge, and you snipped the very tip away with a single, precise cut, the severed fibers falling onto the table in a tiny black curl that was so light it drifted sideways as it fell. The fresh wick now showed a clean, pale edge, ready to draw the kerosene upward and feed the flame with a steady, even supply of fuel, and you returned the scissors to their box and looked down at the lamp with the quiet satisfaction of a task completed. A small, preparatory ritual that was as familiar as buttoning your coat or lacing your mukluks. You reached for the box of matches, a small wooden container that had once held sardines and now held perhaps 24 sulfur matches. Their heads a pale, powdery pink, their sticks rough and splintery and slightly bent from being packed too tightly together. The box rattled softly as you picked it up, a dry, hollow sound that was the voice of the matches themselves, and you slid the lid open with your thumb, the wood dragging against wood in a way that produced a soft, gritty friction. Inside, the matches lay in a jumbled pile, their heads pointing in all directions, and you selected one that was straight and whole, pulling it free from the tangle and closing the lid again, setting the box back on the table in its accustomed spot beside the lamp base. The match felt dry and light between your fingers, its stick rough against your skin, its head a compact little bulb of chemicals that would, with a single sharp stroke, transform themselves into fire. You held the match for a moment, not hesitating, but simply pausing, letting the quiet of the cabin settle around you, aware of the wind outside and the stove behind you and the dark window before you, and then you struck the match against the rough patch on the side of the box with a single, quick motion, a motion that was both firm and controlled, the exact pressure needed to ignite the sulfur without breaking the stick. The match flared to life with a soft, hissing sound, a sudden burst of yellow flame that was almost white at its core, its heat washing over your fingers in a wave that was too brief to burn, but strong enough to make you blink. A puff of sulphurous smoke, sharp and acrid, rose from the head and curled upward, thinning and dispersing into the air, and the smell of it joined the other smells of the cabin, a brief, pungent note that would fade in a few seconds and leave only the faint, lingering memory of ignition. You cupped your free hand around the flame, a habit born of drafty tents and windy nights, though the cabin was still enough that the flame barely flickered, and you lowered the match toward the wick, bringing the fire to the cotton with a slow, steady motion, watching the flame bend and stretch downward as it neared its target. The wick caught instantly, the kerosene vapor igniting with a soft, almost silent puff, and a new flame sprang up from the wick's edge, small at first and blue at its base, then yellow and bright as it grew stronger, feeding on the fuel that the wick was drawing upward from the reservoir. The match flame, suddenly redundant, guttered and died in your fingers, and you shook the matchstick once, twice, until the faint, orange glow at its tip went dark, and then you set the spent match aside on the tin plate, where it would wait until morning to be thrown into the stove. You lifted the glass chimney carefully, its surface now warm from the heat of your hand, and you fitted it back into the brass collar, seating it with a gentle, twisting motion that locked it into place, the flare of the chimney settling into the slot with a soft, satisfying click. The flame inside the chimney, now protected from any stray drafts, steadied itself and rose a little higher, drawing itself into a perfect golden teardrop that wavered only slightly, its tip a fine point of nearly invisible blue, its body a warm, translucent yellow that seemed to glow from within, a living, breathing shape made of light and heat and the slow consumption of oil. The lamp was now lit, and the character of the room changed instantly, the way a face changes when the eyes open, the same familiar space suddenly infused with a new kind of presence, a new center of attention that drew your gaze and held it with a gentle, hypnotic pull. The stove's glow, which had dominated the room all evening, now became a background warmth, a low red-orange foundation over which the lamp's brighter, whiter light laid a crisp, golden overlay, and the two lights together, the firelight and the lamplight, created a layered, textured illumination that made the shadows deeper and the highlights sharper, and every surface in the cabin seemed richer and more detailed than before. You sat down on the stool that you kept under the table, a low, three-legged seat made from a round of birch log, with three smaller branches fitted into holes drilled at angles, and you rested your elbows on the tabletop and let your face come close to the lamp, close enough that you could feel the warmth of the flame on your cheeks. A gentle, radiant heat that was different from the dry, intense heat of the stove. Softer and more diffuse, like the warmth of a hand held near but not touching the skin. The smell of the burning kerosene reached your nose, a faint, metallic odor that was not unpleasant. A clean, sharp scent that carried with it associations of other nights, other cabins, other lamps that had burned through the dark hours while you read or mended or simply sat and watched the flame as you were watching it now. The kerosene smell mixed with the spruce smoke from the stove and the sharp green scent of the spruce boughs on the bunk and the faint salty trace of the salt pork on the shelf, and together these smells formed the olfactory signature of the cabin, a blend that was as familiar to you as the smell of your own skin. A blend that was as familiar to you as the smell of your own skin, a blend that meant shelter and warmth and the quiet, solitary peace of the long winter evenings. The lamp's flame was not perfectly still. It wavered slightly, its tip swaying in a tiny slow motion that was almost imperceptible, a dance caused by the minute currents of air that moved through the cabin, the same currents that you had heard whispering through the chinking earlier, now made visible by their effect on the flame. When you moved your hand near the lamp, the flame responded, leaning away from your fingers as if it were a living thing aware of your presence. And when you sat perfectly still, it returned to its upright posture, a steady, unwavering teardrop of light that seemed to float just above the wick. A bright spirit housed in glass and brass. The light it cast reached out across the table, illuminating the tin plate and the fork and spoon and the bone-handled knife and the clay mug with its chip and its frozen coffee dregs. And each of these objects cast a shadow that stretched away from the lamp and merged with the larger shadows that filled the corners of the room. The shadows were soft and indistinct, their edges blurring as they moved farther from the source of light, and they shifted constantly, responding to every tiny motion of the flame, so that the cabin seemed to be alive with shapes that moved without purpose, shapes that appeared and disappeared and transformed themselves from one thing into another as the flame danced its slow, silent dance. You watched the shadows on the log walls, the way they rose and fell and stretched and contracted, and you saw, in their vague, shifting forms, the suggestion of faces and animals and landscapes, the same kind of illusions that you might see in the clouds on a summer afternoon or in the patterns of the frost on the window. A shadow would gather itself into what seemed for a moment like the profile of a mountain ridge, the sharp peak and the sloping shoulder and the deep shadowed valley below. And then the flame would flicker and the mountain would dissolve into a formless dark patch that was nothing at all, only the absence of light on the rough, uneven surface of the logs. Another shadow would stretch upward from the salt pork on its plate, and for a brief instant it would resemble a crouching animal, a dog or a fox, its back curved and its head low, and then the lamp would sway with your breath and the animal would vanish, leaving only the common shadow of a lump of meat wrapped in cheesecloth. These illusions were not startling or significant. They were simply the byproduct of the light and the dark and the movement of the air, and you observed them with the same calm, detached attention that you gave to the frost on the window or the sound of the wind, an attention that asked for nothing but the simple act of seeing. You reached for the small brass key on the side of the wick mechanism, the one that controlled the height of the wick, and you gave it a tiny turn, just a fraction of an inch, adjusting the flame's size with the precision that came from long practice. Turned too high, the wick would produce a tall, smoky flame that would send a thin stream of black soot up into the chimney, darkening the glass and wasting the kerosene, and turned too low, the flame would shrink and sputter and eventually drown in its own fuel, leaving the cabin in darkness. The right setting was a point just below the threshold of smoke, where the flame was bright and steady, and consumed the kerosene at a slow, even rate that would allow it to burn for many hours before the reservoir needed refilling. You found that point now, your fingers turning the key with a gentle, incremental motion, and you watched the flame respond, shrinking slightly, its tip rounding into a more compact, more intense teardrop, its color shifting from a pale, wavering yellow to a rich, deep gold that was almost orange at its core. Satisfied with the adjustment, you withdrew your hand and rested it on the table, and you continued to watch the lamp, your eyes tracing the outline of the chimney, the gentle curve of the brass base, the small bright circle of the flame that was now burning with the quiet, efficient perfection of a tool that was well maintained and properly used. The lamp had been with you since the beginning, since the first night you had spent in this cabin, when the walls were still green and the chinking was still damp and the roof was not yet covered with sod, and you had hung a blanket over the window and sat on the floor, too exhausted to build the bunk, and watched the lamp burn through the long, uncertain hours of that first darkness. It had travelled with you from Dawson, wrapped in your spare shirt and packed in the centre of your bedroll, and before that it had belonged to a prospector on the Fortimile who had given up and gone home, trading his gear for a ticket on the steamer and leaving the lamp behind with a trader who had sold it to you for a pinch of gold dust and a small nugget that you had found in a tributary creek. The lamp had been new once, its brass shiny and its chimney spotless, and it had passed through many hands and many nights, accumulating the small marks and dents and stains that now gave it its character, and it would, if you cared for it properly, burn through many more nights, long after this cabin had been abandoned and the creek had given up the last of its gold, long after you yourself had moved on to some other valley or some other life. You did not think of these things in any dramatic way, not as a story with a beginning and an end, but simply as a quiet fact, a background awareness that the lamp was both a tool and a companion, a small, reliable presence that asked for nothing but a little kerosene and an occasional trimming of the wick, and that gave, in return, the gift of light, the gift of a golden circle in the vast, black winter night. The bunk was more than a place to sleep. It was the center of rest in the small world of the cabin, the destination toward which the entire evening had been slowly, patiently moving, and now, with the lamp burning steadily on the table and the stove glowing its deep, pulsing orange behind the mica window, the time had come to turn toward it with the same quiet attention that you had given to the fire and the shelf and the frost on the glass. The bunk stood against the wall opposite the stove, a low platform that you had built in the first days after the cabin was raised, when the roof was still open to the sky and the floor was still bare earth, and it had been your bed ever since, through the long, pale nights of summer and the deep black nights of winter, a constant, reliable presence that asked nothing of you except that you lie down and let the day's weight slip away. It was a simple structure, built from 4 poles of spruce that you had cut to length and lashed together with strips of rawhide, the poles notched at the corners so that they fit snugly against one another, forming a rectangle that was just long enough for your body and just wide enough that you could turn from one side to the other without falling off. The platform was raised about 2 feet above the floor on 4 stubby legs, each leg a short section of log set into a hole bored into the corner joints, and the whole thing was wedged tightly between the logs of the walls so that it could not shift or wobble no matter how much you moved in your sleep. Over the poles you had laid a mattress of spruce tips, the same kind of fragrant feathery branches that you had used to cover the roof, and this mattress was the secret of the bunk's comfort, the reason that you could sleep soundly through the coldest nights without feeling the hardness of the wood beneath you. The spruce tips had been gathered in the late autumn before the first heavy snow, when the needles were still green and flexible and full of the sharp, clean oils that gave them their lasting fragrance. You had walked up the slope behind the cabin with a canvas sack and the small hand axe, and you had selected the youngest branches from the lower limbs of the trees, the ones with the softest, lightest needles, and you had cut them carefully, taking only what you needed, leaving the trees themselves whole and healthy. The sack had grown heavy on your shoulder as you worked, the branches spilling out over the top in a fragrant, green cascade, and you had carried them back to the cabin and spread them out on the floor to dry for a day, letting the excess moisture evaporate so that they would not mold or rot in the close, warm air of the cabin. Then you had laid them on the bunk platform in thick, even layers, the stems pointing inward toward the center, the tips fanning out toward the edges, building up a mattress that was perhaps 6 inches deep when it was fresh, soft and springy, and full of the wild, resinous scent of the forest. Over the weeks and months since then, the needles had dried and settled, the soft green tips fading to a pale silvery brown, the stems becoming brittle and snapping when you pressed on them too hard, and the mattress had compressed to perhaps half its original thickness, conforming to the shape of your body, creating a shallow depression where your hips and shoulders rested each night, a custom-fitted hollow that was as comfortable as any feather bed could ever be. You stood beside the bunk now and looked down at the mattress of spruce boughs, seeing the way the dried needles caught the lamplight in a fine, golden haze, the tiny, slender leaves overlapping and interweaving in a complex, tangled mat that still held, even after all these weeks, the faint, clean scent of the living tree. The smell was stronger when you disturbed the boughs, when you pressed your hand into them or shifted your weight on them, and it rose up around you now as you reached down and smoothed the surface, your palm brushing over the dry, rustling needles, feeling their texture, the way they were both soft and sharp at the same time, the way they yielded to pressure and then sprang back slightly when you lifted your hand. The scent was a distillation of the northern forest, a blend of pine and earth and the faint, sweet undertone of the sap that had once flowed through the living branches, and it filled your nose and your throat with a freshness that was both calming and invigorating, a reminder of the green world that lay buried under the snow, waiting for the long winter to pass. Over the spruce tips you had spread a wool blanket, a simple grey blanket of the kind that could be bought at any trading post, its fibers coarse and scratchy against bare skin, but warm and durable and heavy with the weight of good, solid weaving. The blanket was tucked under the edges of the mattress, its corners folded neatly, its surface rumpled from the night before, when you had pulled it up over your shoulders and slept with it wrapped around you like a cocoon. On top of the grey blanket, folded at the foot of the bunk, lay the Hudson's Bay blanket, a heavier, thicker blanket that you had traded for in Dawson with a small pouch of gold dust, its wool dyed in the famous stripes of cream and red and green and dark blue, the colours now faded and softened by many washings until they had become muted, gentle versions of themselves, like a memory of brightness rather than brightness itself. The Hudson's Bay blanket was your luxury, the one item in the cabin that you had chosen not for strict utility but for the pleasure of its quality, the way its dense, soft wool felt against your skin, the way it held the warmth of the stove in your body and released it slowly through the night, and you saved it for the coldest hours, the deep, still hours after midnight, when the fire would burn low and the temperature would drop and the extra weight of the striped blanket made the difference between comfortable sleep and restless, shivering wakefulness. Beside the bunk, on the small shelf that you had nailed to the wall just above the pillow, sat the candle stub and the tin of matches and the worn book with its warped cover, its pages swollen and then dried again, the print still legible, but the paper so fragile that you turned the pages with a particular care, holding them by the very edges, reading a few paragraphs each night before the lamp was extinguished. The book was a novel, a story of adventure and distant cities that you had read 3 times now, the plot so familiar that you no longer needed to follow it closely, but could let the words wash over you in a gentle, rhythmic stream, the sentences forming and dissolving without any demand on your attention. A quiet, literary lullaby that eased the mind towards sleep. The pillow itself was a flour sack stuffed with more spruce tips and a few scraps of cotton cloth, its shape lumpy and irregular, conforming to the curve of your neck and the weight of your head in a way that was not elegant, but effective, and it smelled, like everything else in the bunk, of spruce and wood smoke and the faint, clean odor of your own hair. You sat down on the edge of the bunk, the spruce boughs shifting and rustling under your weight, releasing a new wave of that sharp green scent into the air, and you felt the mattress yield beneath you, the dried needles compressing into a shape that was already, even before you lay down, beginning to conform to the contours of your body. You reached down to unlace your inner socks, the last layer that still covered your feet, and you worked the knots loose with slow, patient fingers, feeling the wool slip and stretch as the laces came undone. The socks slid off easily, the thin, worn wool peeling away from your skin, and your bare feet emerged into the cool air of the cabin, the toes pale and slightly wrinkled from the long day inside the mutlux, the nails thick and yellowed, the skin on the heels rough and cracked from the dry winter air. You flexed your toes and felt the coolness wash over them, a pleasant, refreshing sensation that made you aware of the warmth of the rest of your body, the contrast between the cool air on your feet and the warm wool still wrapped around your chest and legs. You set the socks aside on the foot of the bunk, next to the folded Hudson's Bay blanket, and you remain sitting there for a moment, your hands resting on your thighs, your bare feet dangling just above the floorboards, your gaze moving slowly around the cabin, taking in the lamp on the table, and the glow of the stove and the dark square of the frost-covered window, the familiar shapes and shadows that had become, over the months, the whole of your known world. The bunk held you with a gentle, patient embrace, the spruce boughs already warming under your body, the wool blanket soft against your hands, and you felt the last of the day's tension begin to drain away, seeping out through your feet and into the floor, leaving behind only a deep, quiet heaviness that was the precursor to sleep. The cabin was ready, the fire was ready, the lamp was ready, the bunk was ready, and you were ready. A quiet, solitary figure sitting on the edge of a bed of pine boughs in a small log room at the edge of the frozen wilderness, waiting for the long night to carry you gently into rest. The moment arrived, as it always did, when the lamp had burned long enough and the fire had settled into its deep, steady glow, and the weight of your own body on the spruce boughs had become a quiet, insistent reminder that the day was over and the night was waiting. You rose from the bunk with a slow, heavy motion, your bare feet meeting the cool floorboards, and you crossed the short distance to the table where the lamp still burned, its flame now slightly shorter than before, a sign that the kerosene in the reservoir was beginning to run low, though there was still plenty for another hour or two of light. The lamp's glow had been your companion through the long evening, a small golden sun that had held the darkness at bay while you tended the fire, and counted the supplies and traced the scratches on the gold pan, and watched the frost spread across the window, and listened to the wind breathe against the logs. And now, as you stood before it, you felt a quiet gratitude for its steady, faithful service. A gratitude that did not take the form of words but simply of a moment's pause, a brief, silent acknowledgments of the small brass and brass had. You leaned down and cupped your hand around the top of the chimney, feeling the warmth of the glass against your palm, a warmth that was just on the edge of uncomfortable, and you brought your face close to the lamp, close enough that your breath stirred the flame and made it flicker and dance. The flame bent away from you, stretching sideways for a moment, and then you pursed your lips and blew a single sharp breath across the top of the chimney, a breath that was just strong enough to extinguish the flame, but not so strong that it would send a puff of smoke into the room. The flame vanished instantly, collapsing from a bright living presence into a thin, curling ribbon of white smoke that rose from the wick and twisted upward, catching the last remnants of heat from the chimney. And then it was gone, and the cabin was plunged into a darkness that was deeper and more complete than any darkness you had known all evening. The only light that remained was the faint orange glow of the stove, pulsing softly behind the mica window, a glow that was too weak to illuminate anything beyond the small circle of the floor directly in front of the firebox, a glow that was more like the memory of light than light itself, a dim amber suggestion that barely reached the edges of the bunk and left the rest of the cabin in a soft, velvety blackness that seemed to press gently against your eyes. You stood still for a moment, letting your senses adjust to the sudden absence of the lamp, and the smell of the extinguished wick reached your nose, a sharp, acrid odor that was not unpleasant, the smell of a candle snuffed out or a fire doused, a smell that signaled the end of something, the closing of a chapter, the final, definitive transition from the waking hours to the hours of sleep. The smoke from the wick curled upward and dispersed into the darkness, and after a few seconds the smell faded, replaced by the familiar blend of spruce and wood smoke and the faint metallic trace of the cooling kerosene. The darkness itself was not uniform. It had depths and textures, pools of absolute black in the corners of the room, and softer, more porous shadows near the stove, and you navigated through it by the memory of the space, your body knowing exactly where the table was and where the stool stood, and where the edge of the rug lay, your feet finding the floorboards with the same instinctive certainty that they had found the path from the creek earlier in the evening. You returned to the bunk, your hands reaching out to find the edge of the platform, the rough, splintery surface of the spruce poles, and you turned and sat down once more on the mattress of pine boughs, feeling them shift and rustle under your weight, releasing their sharp, clean scent into the dark air. The grey wool blanket was cool against your legs, and you lifted it and slid your feet underneath, then your legs, then your whole body, lowering yourself onto the mattress with a slow, careful motion that allowed the spruce tips to adjust to your weight and cradle you in their soft, uneven embrace. You lay on your back at first, your head settling into the lumpy pillow, your arms resting at your sides, your eyes open and staring upward into the darkness where the ceiling was, though you could see nothing at all, not even a hint of the poles and the sod and the underside of the roof, nothing but a deep, featureless black that seemed to stretch upward forever, as if the cabin had no roof at all, and the night sky itself had come down to rest just above your face. The darkness was so complete that you could not tell whether your eyes were open or closed, and after a while you closed them just to have the certainty of it, just to feel the small, deliberate motion of your eyelids falling shut, sealing out a darkness that was no different from the darkness inside your own head. The stove ticked on, its sound now slower and softer than before, the fire having consumed the spruce log down to a thick, solid bed of coals that would glow for hours, radiating a steady, gentle warmth that you could feel on your face and your hands, and the parts of your chest that were not covered by the blanket. The fire had entered its final phase, the long, slow burn that would last until nearly morning, and you listened to the quiet, pulsing sound of the embers shifting and settling, a sound that was like the breathing of a sleeping animal, slow and regular and deeply peaceful. The wind outside had calmed somewhat, its long, mournful sighs now fewer and farther between, the gusts coming in shorter, gentler bursts that barely stirred the chinking and made only the faintest whisper against the window. The snow you imagined was still falling, piling silently onto the roof and the trees and the frozen creek, adding layer upon layer to the white blanket that covered the valley, and the thought of all that slow, patient accumulation was soothing, a reminder that the world outside was still, that nothing was moving, that the long dark hours would pass in their own time, unhurried and inevitable. You turned onto your side, the spruce boughs rustling around you, and you pulled the grey blanket up to your chin, then reached down and drew the Hudson's Bay blanket up from the foot of the bunk, its heavy, striped wool settling over you with a weight that was both physical and psychological, a weight that seemed to press you deeper into the mattress, deeper into the slow, approaching tide of sleep, of the quiet, deeper into the slow, approaching tide of sleep. The blanket smelled faintly of wool and wood smoke, and the distant, clean fragrance of the spruce tips that it had covered for so many nights, and you tucked it around your shoulders and let your body relax into the hollow that the mattress had formed over the weeks, a hollow that was exactly the shape of you, a mold of your sleeping self that received you now like a cupped hand receiving a stone, a perfect, custom fit that required no adjustment or shifting. Your breathing slowed, settling into a long, even rhythm that matched the tick of the stove and the whisper of the wind and the soft, distant creak of the roof, and your thoughts, which had been drifting lazily through the evening like the snowflakes drifting outside, began to fragment and dissolve, losing their edges, blurring into one another, becoming less like thoughts and more like sensations, impressions, the faint echoes of the day. In the darkness behind your closed eyes, the window was beginning to change, though you were not awake enough to notice it consciously, the change registering only as a subtle shift in the quality of the blackness that surrounded you, a lightening so gradual that it was more like a memory of light than light itself. The frost on the glass, which had been a white, opaque sheet when you last looked, was now beginning to glow faintly, a pale, milky luminescence that came from the snow outside, reflecting the first tentative hint of the dawn that was still hours away. A dawn that had not yet broken over the ridges, but that was sending its advance notice in the form of a soft, grey light that filled the valley and seeped through the frost and the glass and into the cabin, barely visible, barely there, but present. The window, which had been a black square all night, was now a faint ghostly rectangle, a shape that stood out against the darker logs of the wall, and the light that came through it was so weak that it illuminated nothing, cast no shadows, only softened the darkness in the corner of the room nearest the glass. You did not see this, lying with your back to the window and your face turned toward the stove. But the cabin itself received the light, the logs and the floorboards and the table and the shelf and the gold pan all registering, in some inanimate way, the slow return of the sun. The fire in the stove had burned down to a bed of deep red coals, their glow now barely visible through the mica window, a faint pulsing ember that was the last dying heartbeat of the spruce log you had placed there hours ago. The coals would last another hour, perhaps two, and then they would cool into a fine grey ash that would wait for the morning and the fresh wood and the strike of a match, a new fire to chase away the new day's cold. But that was still ahead, a task for the waking hours, and for now the embers did their quiet work, radiating the last of their warmth into the cabin, a warmth that was gentle and steady and utterly sufficient. The water bucket in the corner had developed a thicker skin of ice during the night, a crust that had grown from a thin, transparent film into a solid white lid that sealed the water below, and the axe leaning against the wall beside it had grown cold, its metal blade contracting in the low temperature, its wooden handle dry and rough and waiting. The shelf above the table was still, its row of provisions standing in the darkness like a line of silent sentinels, the blue tin of beans, the cotton sack of flour, the salt pork wrapped in cheesecloth, the paper packet of baking powder, the dented can of coffee, all of them waiting for the morning, waiting for the routine of another day. Your breathing had become so slow and deep now that your chest rose and fell almost imperceptibly, the grey blanket moving with you in a soft, gentle rhythm, and your face, relaxed in sleep, was turned toward the stove, the faint, orange glow falling across your closed eyes and your slightly parted lips and the rough, stubbled curve of your jaw. The tension that had lived in your shoulders and your neck and your hands had dissolved entirely, leaving your body loose and heavy and deeply at peace. A state of rest that was not just the absence of movement, but a positive, enveloping presence, a blanket of stillness that wrapped around you as surely as the wool blankets and the spruce tips and the log walls of the cabin. Outside, the snow continued to fall, the flakes smaller and finer now, as the temperature dropped toward its lowest point, the hour just before dawn when the cold was always sharpest and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the sun. The spruce trees stood motionless in their deep white coats, their branches bending lower under the accumulating weight, and the creek lay silent under its 2 feet of ice and its thick blanket of snow, its water still flowing in the darkness below, a slow black current that moved without sound and without light, carrying the fine, suspended particles of gold that had not yet been found, that would not be found until the spring thaw came, and the water rose and the gravel shifted, and the long hut slow work of the guy. You slept on, unaware of the trees or the creek or the snow or the gold, unaware of the faint grey light that was slowly filling the window behind you, unaware of the stove's last glowing embers or the frost on the glass or the small quiet sounds of the cabin settling into the coldest hour of the night. Your sleep was deep and dreamless, a vast empty space that held you gently and asked nothing of you, a sleep that was earned by the long day of labor and the long evening of quiet ritual, a sleep that was the final, perfect gift of the winter night. The darkness of the cabin remained around you, heavy and still and complete, and it would hold you in its embrace until the morning, when the sun, invisible behind the heavy clouds, would climb over the ridges and fill the valley with a pale, diffused light, and you would open your eyes and see the frost on the window glowing white and gold, and you would rise and build the fire and grind the coffee and begin the slow, familiar rhythm of another day. But that was still hours away, a distant, quiet promise, and for now there was only the darkness, the warmth, the slow, even breath of your sleeping body, the soft, steady tick of the stove, and the long, silent fall of the snow outside the cabin walls.